Afternoon light filtered through the bare branches, and most people hurried along the path with their collars turned up, focused on getting home. Rachel Donovan held her daughter's hand as they cut across the park, trying to make it back to their apartment in Brooklyn before the temperature dropped even further. She had just finished a long shift. Her feet ached, and she was thinking about dinner bills and the dozen other worries that had become part of her daily routine. Amelia, 8 years old and stubbornly tender-hearted, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, "why is that man lying there?" Rachel followed her daughter's gaze and froze. On a bench near the walking trail, a man sat, hunched forward, arms wrapped tightly around himself, clothes damp from the drizzle earlier that morning. His hair hung over his forehead, and his shoulders shook lightly as if he were trying to warm himself, but couldn't. At first glance, he looked like any of the countless people in the city who'd fallen on hard times. But then, Rachel noticed something that didn't fit a watch on his wrist, elegant and unmistakably expensive, the kind you don't buy on a whim. "Come on," she murmured, trying to pull Amelia away. "It's not our business." But Amelia didn't move. Her small voice cut through the cold air like a bell. "Mom, can he live with us?" Rachel stared at her daughter, stunned. The words weren't dramatic or loud. They were simple, earnest, and impossibly kind. The sort of words only a child could say without hesitation. Before Rachel could answer, the man lifted his head. His eyes, tired but surprisingly clear, focused on Amelia first, then her. He tried to straighten up as if embarrassed to be seen. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice soft but refined. "I didn't mean to worry you." Rachel stiffened. That voice didn't match his appearance at all. It was smooth, practiced, like someone who'd spent years negotiating boardrooms, not park benches. "Are you hurt?" she asked, keeping her tone guarded. "I'm fine," he replied. But the moment he pushed himself off the bench, his knees buckled. He caught the edge of the seat to stop himself from falling. That was all it took for Amelia to step closer. "Mom, we can't leave him." Rachel fought the instinct to refuse. The city had taught her caution. She and her daughter lived in a cramped walk-up with rent that seemed to rise faster than her paycheck. She didn't have room to invite trouble into her life. But seeing him struggle awakened another instinct, one that came from a deeper, quieter place. "Sir," she said, "do you need medical help?" "No hospitals," he whispered, shaking his head. "Just somewhere warm for a little while." His breathing sounded strained. His hands trembled. And despite every warning echoing through her mind, Rachel gently reached out to steady him. "What's your name, Evan?" he said after a moment. "Evan Mercer." It meant nothing to her then, not the name, not the weight it carried. All she saw was someone on the edge of collapse, someone her daughter refused to abandon. Rachel sighed, defeated not by pressure but by compassion. "All right," she said softly. "We don't live far. You can rest there for a bit." Amelia squeezed her mother's hand as if she'd just saved a life. They moved slowly toward the subway entrance, Evan leaning on the railing to steady himself. A small group of tourists noticed them, paused, and began whispering. One of them lifted a phone and started recording, muttering about lawsuits and a woman dragging a drunk guy. Rachel's pulse quickened. The last thing she needed was a misunderstanding going viral. She pulled Amelia closer and hurried them forward. By the time they reached their apartment in Brooklyn, Evan's shaking had worsened. Rachel set him on the couch, flicked on the overhead light, and brought out a first aid kit she hoped she wouldn't need. Amelia handed him a blanket with the seriousness of someone offering a national treasure. "Thank you," Evan said quietly. "Both of you." Rachel finally got a good look at him under the warm, light, strong, jawline hands, scuffed, but not dirty shirt, torn, but made from expensive fabric. Everything about him suggested someone who'd once lived very differently than this. As she helped him remove his soaked jacket, a corner of an envelope slipped out and drifted to the floor. She picked it up without thinking. The logo stamped on it made her breath catch Concordia Bank, one of the largest private institutions in New York. Inside the torn envelope was a hotel key card from the Four Seasons, and beneath that what looked like a receipt for an amount most people couldn't earn in a year. When Rachel looked back at Evan, he seemed suddenly alert, almost wary. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "It fell out." "It's fine," he murmured, though his eyes clouded with something she didn't understand. Before she could ask anything else, he shifted, grimaced, and pressed a hand to his side. Rachel leaned in, not seeing wounds, but seeing exhaustion that looked bone-deep. Amelia sat cross-legged on the floor, chin raised. "Mom, can he stay until he feels better?" Rachel hesitated. She should say no. She knew she should. But looking at Evan, now shaken, mysterious, and yet strangely gentle, she felt a tug she couldn't explain. "We'll see," she said quietly. "For tonight he can rest." Evan exhaled, closing his eyes for the first time since they'd found him. And though Rachel couldn't know it yet, the decision she'd just made would unravel more secrets than she'd ever imagined, turning one ordinary winter afternoon into the moment her life split into before and after. Morning crept into the apartment, gently slipping through the blinds and casting soft lines of light across the small living room. Rachel stood by the kitchen counter watching the coffee maker sputter and hiss, trying to convince herself the night before had actually happened. On the couch, covered with a blanket that had seen better days, Evan Mercer slept as if he hadn't closed his eyes in weeks. There was a tightness around his jaw, even in rest, a tension that didn't fit with the peaceful warmth of the room. When he finally stirred, it wasn't with the slow stretch of someone waking from comfort. It was sharp, cautious, as though he expected danger the moment he opened his eyes. His gaze darted around until he remembered where he was, and only then did his shoulders drop a fraction. Rachel offered him a mug of coffee, and he accepted it with a quiet thank you, gripping it like he needed the heat to steady himself. Amelia was already dressed for school, sitting at the small dining table with her backpack at her feet. She studied Evan openly, as children tend to do, her curiosity unfiltered. "Are you feeling better today?" she asked. Evan managed a faint smile. "A little, thanks to you both." Rachel noted the way he spoke carefully, choosing every word, as though each carried weight. She kept her voice even when she replied. "You can rest here until you're able to get back on your feet. That's all we can offer." He nodded with gratitude, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something like hesitation or maybe regret. While Amelia finished her breakfast, Rachel caught glimpses of him watching the apartment in a way that didn't feel intrusive, just observant, as though he was trying to place himself in a world far from his own. After Amelia left for school, Evan finally asked, "Do you live here alone with her?" "Just us," Rachel answered. Her dad hasn't been in the picture for years. She didn't elaborate and he didn't pry. But there was a brief moment when their eyes met, and something unsaid passed between them, an understanding that some stories were too heavy for early morning conversation. Evan tried to stand and nearly lost his balance again. Rachel quickly moved to steady him, her hand meeting his arm. His muscles tensed instinctively before he relaxed. "Take it slow," she cautioned. "You're not as fine as you want us to think." "I'm used to handling things on my own," he murmured, and she suspected that was true in more ways than one. He spent the next hour regaining his strength, sipping coffee, and assuring her he didn't intend to stay longer than necessary. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was avoiding real answers. When she asked if he had family or friends nearby, he hesitated too long. When she suggested contacting the people from the card found in the envelope Concordia Bank, he stiffened. "I need to stay off their radar for now," he said finally. "Whose radar?" she pressed. He rubbed his forehead, looking suddenly older than he had the night before. There are people who think I'm a problem. People who want something from me and they're not above persuasion. The vague explanation only raised more questions. Rachel stepped back, folded her arms, and studied him. Evan, I let you in because my daughter asked me to, not because I know anything about you. If there's something dangerous connected to you, I need to know. He looked up at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something raw fear. Not of her, but of the truth itself. I won't bring trouble to your door, he said softly. I just need time to figure out my next move. The sincerity in his voice made her hesitate. She opened her mouth to say something else, but a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. It wasn't a neighbor's knock. It was firm, deliberate, controlled. Rachel felt her chest tighten. She glanced at Evan, who instantly straightened, every trace of exhaustion replaced by alertness. Are you expecting someone? He whispered. No. He motioned for her to stay back. Rachel ignored him and approached the door carefully, peering through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood in the hallway. He wasn't familiar, and something about him felt too polished for their building. Miss Donovan, he called through the door. I'm looking for someone who may have come through this floor last night. Rachel said nothing. The man continued. Tall, dark hair, late 30s, possibly injured. Oh, we're concerned about his well-being. Every instinct in her body screamed caution. She stepped back quietly and shook her head at Evan. His expression hardened, confirming what she already suspected. Whoever that man was, Evan didn't trust him. The knock eventually stopped footsteps fading down the hallway, but the tension lingered in the air. Evan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. Rachel wanted answers, but she could see he wasn't ready to give them. Not yet. Instead, she told him the one thing she could offer with certainty. You can stay until you're steady enough to leave. But if something is coming, I need to know before it reaches my daughter. He nodded, visibly weighed down by more than his injuries. I'll tell you what I can. Just not all at once. The rest of the afternoon passed in an uneasy rhythm. While Rachel prepared lunch, Amelia returned home with a drawing for Evan, a bright picture of a son over a bench, a small figure sitting alone. It's you, she said proudly, but I made it warmer. The look on Evan's face softened, the first unguarded expression Rachel had seen from him. Yet behind it, she could still sense the shadows. A man who didn't belong on park benches or in cramped apartments. A man carrying secrets too heavy for the fragile peace of their home. And though she didn't know his full story, she could already feel it. Whatever had driven him into the cold wasn't finished with him yet. Rain drifted over Brooklyn that afternoon, tapping lightly against the windows as if the sky itself was hesitant to disturb the quiet inside Rachel's apartment. She had just finished folding laundry when another knock echoed through the hallway, firmer, more certain than the man in the suit earlier that morning. Evan looked up from the couch instantly, tension tightening every line of his body. It wasn't the kind of knock that belonged to a neighbor or a delivery driver. It had purpose behind it. It had authority. Rachel placed a finger to her lips and approached the door slowly, her heartbeat quickening with every step. When she checked the peephole, she froze. Two men in tailored suits stood outside, clean-cut, polished, projecting the kind of confidence that only came from money or power. One of them held a leather folder. The other scanned the hallway like he expected someone to attack. Ms. Donovan, the man with the folder, called out. We're here on urgent business. We need to speak with Evan Mercer. Rachel's breath caught. They knew his name. She stepped back from the door and looked over her shoulder. Evan had already risen to his feet, jaw-clenched eyes dark with something between dread and resignation. He motioned for her to unlock the door. She hesitated. Are you sure? Yes, he whispered. It was only a matter of time. The moment she opened the door, the two men straightened as if greeting royalty. Mr. Mercer, the taller one, said, and there was no mistaking the respect in his tone. "Thank God we found you." For a long second, silence filled the apartment. Rachel stared at them, then at Evan, then back again, trying to understand what she was seeing. The men weren't angry, they weren't suspicious, they were deferential. "We apologize for the intrusion," Miss Donovan, the second man, added quickly. "We've been searching for him for 2 days. His disappearance has caused significant concern." Evan didn't respond. His face remained composed, but Rachel could see the strain behind his eyes. "We need you to come with us," the first man said. "There are urgent matters at the company you must address. The board is in chaos. Your brother has—" "That's enough," Evan interrupted sharply. "Not here." The men exchanged glances and fell silent. One of them stepped aside politely, as if expecting Evan to walk out with them immediately, but he stayed rooted to the floor. Rachel folded her arms to steady herself. "Can someone please explain what's going on?" The men looked to Evan, waiting for his permission. When he finally nodded, the taller one took a breath. "Mr. Mercer is the acting CEO of Mercer Holdings." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass. Rachel felt the world tilt. CEO, Mercer Holdings. One of the most powerful private companies in New York, controlling investments, real estate, and a dozen subsidiaries. The kind of company that made headlines when it bought skyscrapers or funded city projects. She had seen the name plastered on billboards and steel plaques across Manhattan. And the man who had been sleeping on her couch wearing a torn shirt and borrowed blanket was the head of it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, unsure if she was speaking to him or to herself. "You're... what?" Evan didn't flinch. "It's complicated." "It usually is," Rachel muttered, still trying to catch up. The second man opened the leather folder revealing documents covered with signatures and financial seals. "Your brother filed an emergency petition declaring you mentally unfit to lead the company. He's attempting to take control of the board. We've managed to stall the vote, but not for long." Rachel stared at Evan, searching for any sign she had misjudged him. But she saw only quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from being betrayed by someone blood deep. "You shouldn't have come here," Evan said tightly, "if he finds out where I've been." "Sir," the man interrupted, "the situation is deteriorating. The press is asking questions. Rumors are spreading. Investors are calling every hour," I said. "Not here," Evan growled, and the steel in his voice made even Rachel go still. The men nodded again, stepping back toward the hall. "We'll wait downstairs." When the door closed, the apartment fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the rain outside. Rachel sank into the nearest chair. "Evan, you need to tell me the truth now. All of it." He sank down across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I wasn't honest because I didn't want to drag you or Amelia into this. I didn't want anyone to use you to get to me." His voice was steady but carried the weight of days, maybe years. "The company. It's been under pressure for a long time. I discovered financial discrepancies, large ones. Someone was siphoning money out of our international investments. When I got close to the source, things started happening. Employees turning suddenly hostile, surveillance, false accusations." He paused, and then my brother petitioned the board to remove me. Rachel tried to process everything, and somehow the hardest part wasn't that he was a CEO. It was that he'd walked into her life not as a billionaire or a leader, but as a man exhausted from fighting battles no one else could see. "Why didn't you just go to the police?" she asked. "They'd never outrank our own lawyers," he said quietly. "My brother controls too many people. I needed time to gather evidence, but I didn't get far enough before they forced me out." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "The night you found me, someone pushed me to the ground after a confrontation outside the hotel. I didn't even see who, I just ran. The puzzle pieces fell into place. His fear of being followed, the torn envelope, the hotel keycard, the expensive watch covered by a worn coat." Amelia, who had been coloring quietly in her room, suddenly appeared in the doorway. "Mom, why is everyone yelling?" Rachel forced a smile. "We're not yelling, sweetheart, just talking." She looked back at Evan. "What are you going to do now?" Evan exhaled, sinking deeper into the couch. "I don't know. If I go back without proof, he'll win. If I disappear again, he'll spin it into something worse." Rachel studied him for a long moment. She had met plenty of people in the city who pretended to be victims, heroes, or martyrs. Evan wasn't pretending anything. He was a man cornered by power and betrayal, stripped down to whatever dignity he could hold on to. "You can't stay here forever," she said gently. "But you don't have to face this alone." He looked up at her and something softened in his expression. Trust, maybe, or the fragile beginning of it. Then another vibration rattled the coffee table. His phone cracked, and Dark had suddenly lit up. Lines of code flashed across the screen. Unauthorized access attempt. Location pinged. Tracking initiated. Evan stared at it, his face going pale. "They found me," he whispered, and everything inside the apartment changed. The moment Evan whispered that they had found him, the air inside the apartment shifted. It was like the temperature dropped 10 degrees, though the heater hummed steadily in the corner. Rachel didn't need details to understand the danger. She could see it in Evan's face, something sharp, familiar to anyone who had ever spent their life watching over their shoulder. She had lived that once with her ex-husband, and she recognized the look of someone being hunted by a force too powerful to fight alone. Before either of them could speak, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the whole apartment went black. Amelia gasped from the hallway, her silhouette trembling in the dim glow from the streetlights outside. "Mom," she called softly. Rachel forced calm into her voice. "It's all right, sweetie, stay close." But it wasn't all right, and both adults knew it. The outage wasn't citywide. The glow from the windows across the street stayed bright. This was targeted, deliberate. Evan moved toward Amelia with steady steps, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "We're going downstairs," he murmured. "Just for a little while." Why, she whispered. "Because it's safer where there are more people," he said, and Rachel could tell he was choosing every word, carefully refusing to scare her. They slipped into the hallway, guided by the emergency lights. The stairwell smelled faintly of paint and dust, but it was bright enough to move quickly. As they descended, the hum of a distant engine echoed from the street, slow crawling like someone patrolling the block. When they stepped outside, the source became clear. A sleek black SUV idled across the street, headlights dimmed, but engine unmistakably running. It wasn't the first time Rachel had seen it. She'd noticed the same model earlier that week, but assumed it belonged to a neighbor. Now she wasn't so sure. Evan stiffened. "Keep walking," he murmured. "Don't look back." They crossed to the busier part of the neighborhood, blending with the cluster of people waiting near the bodega and laundromat. Rachel cradled Amelia close while Evan scanned every corner with a guarded focus. It was in that moment he looked less like someone who needed saving and more like someone trained to anticipate danger before it arrived. "Where do we go?" Rachel asked quietly. "Somewhere unpredictable," he replied. "Somewhere they won't expect." The subway entrance was just 3 blocks away, and the moment he suggested it, Rachel hesitated. Late-night trains weren't her favorite place to be, especially with a child. But the SUV was still there, engine rumbling like a warning. She knew instinctively that staying on the street was worse. They hurried to the station, swiping their Metro cards and moving down the steps as the wind gusted through the tunnel. The platform buzzed with commuters, students, night shift workers, the kind of anonymity only New York could provide. Evan positioned himself slightly behind Rachel and Amelia, shielding them while scanning the crowd. When the train arrived, they boarded quickly. The doors shut, jerking them into motion, and for a moment they all exhaled. The rattling of the tracks, the chatter of strangers, the flickering tunnel lights. It all felt strangely comforting. Danger didn't follow you underground. Not easily, but safety, as Rachel had learned long ago, rarely lasted. Halfway to Times Square, Evan's phone buzzed again, this time with a notification unlike the earlier intrusion. A message from an unknown number flashed on the cracked screen. "You can't run forever, Evan. Come home and face this like a man." He turned the phone over slowly, jaw clenched. "Who sent that?" Rachel whispered. He shook his head. "Someone who has a lot to lose if I stay alive and conscious." Amelia looked up at him, her eyes wide but trusting. "Are we going to be okay?" Evan knelt so he was eye level with her. "You're safe. I promise you that." His voice didn't waver. Whatever fear he had was locked behind a wall she couldn't see. The train screeched into Times Square. They stepped off into the bright underground maze, tourists pointing at maps. Musicians playing guitar near the stairs, a wave of noise and color strong enough to swallow them whole. And for the first time since the blackout, Rachel felt a sliver of relief. Then she saw him. A man standing near the newsstand wearing a crisp business coat despite the heat underground. His eyes swept the crowd with purpose. Searching. Evan saw him too. "We need to move." He guided them through the crowd weaving between families and street performers until they emerged onto the sidewalk above Times Square, glowing in neon chaos. The stranger didn't follow, but the threat lingered. It was too close. While navigating the crowd, Evan's phone buzzed again. Not with a threat this time, but a message with a name he recognized, Jordan Hale, the only friend he still trusted. The message was simple. "We need to meet. I found something." Evan's breath hitched. "Rachel, we have to go." "Go where?" "To someone who can help us end this." They made their way toward a side street where the lights dimmed and the noise thinned. A lone figure waited near a service entrance, tall, sharp-featured, dressed like he'd run out of a board meeting without time to loosen his tie. Jordan Hale. "You really vanished," Jordan said, stepping forward with concern etched across his face. "Do you have any idea what your brother is doing?" Evan shook his head. "I know the basics, not the rest." Jordan opened a thin folder and pressed it into Evan's hands. "This is the rest." Rachel watched the exchange, her pulse quickening as Evan skimmed the documents. She couldn't decipher the details, but she recognized words like unauthorized transfer shell accounts and criminal liability. Enough to understand it was worse than Evan had hinted. Jordan lowered his voice. "Your brother isn't just trying to remove you, he's framing you. If you don't fight back now, he'll walk away clean and you'll take the fall." Evan closed the folder and looked at Rachel, then at Amelia, who clung to her side. For the first time, there was no exhaustion or fear in his expression, only resolve. "I'm going back," he said. Rachel's breath caught. "Back to the company. Back to the truth," he replied. "And I'm not hiding anymore." The wind swept down the street, carrying the city's noise with it. Everything that had unraveled over the past days suddenly pointed toward one moment, one decision that would reshape all their lives. And as they stood beneath the bright signs of Times Square, it was clear nothing about their world would ever be simple again. The morning of the press conference began with a stillness that didn't match the storm Evan was walking into. Washington Square Park was already filling with reporters, cameras, security personnel, and a growing crowd of New Yorkers eager to witness whatever truth had been brewing beneath the polished surface of Mercer Holdings. Rachel stood with Amelia a few steps behind him, tucked among the onlookers, but close enough that he could feel their presence. It grounded him more than he expected. Evan hadn't slept much. Not because of fear, but because he finally knew what had to be done. For too long he had carried the weight of a company built on his father's legacy, a legacy his brother had twisted into something unrecognizable. Running had bought him time, but it hadn't protected the people who depended on the truth. That responsibility wasn't something he could hand off to lawyers or board members. It had to be him, standing in the open, choosing transparency over power. When he stepped up to the podium, flashes erupted like fireworks. The murmurs quieted. Reporters poised with microphones waited for him to speak. But Evan didn't rush. He looked out at the crowd, at the students, the workers, the families, and at Rachel holding Amelia's hand, and he found the strength to begin. "My disappearance made headlines," he said, voice steady. "But what hasn't made headlines yet is why I disappeared." He explained the discrepancies he had uncovered, millions redirected into private accounts, offshore transfers, shell companies with falsified signatures. He spoke of his father's vision for the company, one built on integrity and trust, and how those values had been eroded by someone who believed power was a birthright. He didn't shout or accuse theatrically. He simply laid out the truth with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Then came the part he had dreaded most. My brother, Nicholas Mercer, orchestrated a plan to remove me from leadership. He submitted false documents, manipulated board members, and launched a campaign to discredit my mental competence. He hoped fear would keep me silent. Evan paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But I won't be silent." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters pressed forward, firing questions, but he raised a hand for silence. "I have turned over every piece of evidence to federal investigators. This is no longer a family matter. This is a matter of public trust." When he stepped away, the crowd erupted, some cheering, some shouting questions, all caught in the gravity of what he had unleashed. Rachel watched him walk down the steps, surrounded by security but somehow alone in the moment. When he reached her side, she saw something in him she hadn't before. Relief. Not triumph, not vindication. Just the quiet confirmation that telling the truth had cost him something but had set him free. Over the next days, news broke across every network. Nicholas Mercer was arrested on charges that filled several pages: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The board of Mercer Holdings scrambled to stabilize the company, and in a unanimous vote, they appointed Jordan Hale as the new CEO. The shift was swift and decisive. Change, but cultural change. Evan had chosen not to return to the corner office, even though the board begged him to reconsider. His life had begun shifting long before the press conference. He wasn't chasing titles anymore. Instead, he started building something smaller, quieter, and more meaningful. With the help of local educators, community leaders, and a portion of the trust he still legally inherited, Evan founded the Mercer Community Learning Center, an after-school program focused on STEM tutoring, mentorship, and opportunities for kids who didn't normally get access to that kind of support. The center opened in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, not far from the apartment where everything had begun. Rachel became its program coordinator, a role she took to naturally. The work came alive under her guidance, shaped by her patience and her understanding of families who lived month to month. Amelia became the unofficial ambassador, greeting kids at the door, handing out flyers, and proudly giving tours like she owned the place. The center wasn't just a project. It was a home for children who needed a safe space, and for Evan, who needed purpose beyond corporate walls. One evening, several months after everything had settled, Rachel found Amelia packing a small suitcase in her room. Clothes, her favorite stuffed animal, 2 books and a handful of crayons were tucked neatly inside. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" Rachel asked gently. Amelia looked up with the same earnestness she had shown the day she met Evan. "Is he staying for dinner again?" she asked. "Because if he is, maybe he should stay all night. I packed the things he'll need." Rachel's breath caught a warmth blooming in her chest. "Oh, honey," she whispered, sitting beside her. "Evan doesn't need a suitcase anymore." "Why not?" "Because he's not just visiting." When they walked into the living room, Evan was reviewing the center's upcoming schedule. He looked up, smiling softly at them. Amelia ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Mom says you're staying longer than dinner." He lifted her onto the couch beside him. "Well," he said, Rachel with a tenderness that needed no explanation, "if you'll both have me, I think I'd like to stay for much, much longer." Rachel felt something settle inside her. Not a dramatic realization, just the quiet understanding that sometimes life rearranged itself in ways you never expected. A powerful man had stumbled into her world, battered and lost, but the man sitting before her now wasn't defined by the billion-dollar empire he had walked away from. He was defined by the way he looked at Amelia's drawings, by the patience he brought to tutoring kids, by the steadiness he offered her without saying the words out loud. Home wasn't a place he returned to. It was something they built around each other. Later that night, with the windows open to the sound of the city breathing outside, Amelia fell asleep against Evan's shoulder as he read her favorite story for the 3rd time. Rachel watched from the doorway, smiling at the sight of the 2 people she loved most. One born into her life, the other found in the most unexpected way. Evan looked up, meeting her eyes with a quiet certainty. He didn't need to say it. He was home. Looking back at everything that happened, it's hard to believe how one cold afternoon in Central Park unraveled into a journey that changed the lives of 3 people who never should have crossed paths. Evan Mercer walked into that moment with nothing left, stripped of his title, betrayed by his own family, and carrying the weight of a corporation built on his father's legacy. He didn't come to Rachel and Amelia as a billionaire or a powerful executive. He arrived as a man pushed out of his world, unsure of who to trust, and fighting to stay one step ahead of the truth that had been twisted against him. Yet sometimes life rearranges itself through the smallest acts of human decency. A little girl's simple question, "Mom, can he live with us?" became the turning point that redirected everything. What began as an impulse of kindness grew into a bond that helped a man find the courage to confront the one enemy he never believed he'd have to face, his own brother. Through chaos, fear, and the very real threat of losing everything forever, Evan rediscovered something far more valuable than his company. He found people who believed in him long before the world did. Rachel, who had every reason to walk away, chose compassion over caution. Amelia, with a heart too big for her small frame, brought light into a life dimmed by betrayal. Together they became the anchor that reminded Evan he still had something worth fighting for. And when the truth finally came to light, when the world learned who he really was and what he had endured, his victory wasn't in reclaiming power. It was in choosing a different path entirely. Instead of returning to corporate towers and boardroom battles, Evan chose purpose. He built a community center that reflected the values he wished Mercer Holdings had never abandoned. He focused on children who needed opportunity, families who needed support, and neighborhoods that had been forgotten. In doing so, he found a home, one not defined by wealth or position, but by the people waiting for him at the end of each day. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest turning points in life come disguised as inconvenient interruptions or unexpected strangers. It teaches us that kindness can rewrite the entire direction of a life, and that courage often emerges only after we lose everything we once thought defined us. And most importantly, it shows that home is not the place where you started, but the place where you are finally understood. If this story touched you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of compassion, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful stories that speak to the heart and keep this community growing strong.